And I actually remember having a conversation with Peter Speak Marin a year or two after I started working with him. And I said, I think that there could be a case for having a shop that just sells independent watchmakers like you and Vianney and doesn't have big brands. Anyway, he thought I was mad.
In fairness, maybe he was right.
No, he was at the time. He was.
This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Chapek, Arcanaut, Orage, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
Before we begin today, we'd like to give a shout out to our friends Stephen Pulverant and Justin Hast, who recently started their own podcast and newsletter called The Enthusiasts. We've talked quite a bit on this podcast, including with Stephen himself, about the challenges of conventional watch media, namely conflicts of interest. Now, for its part, The Enthusiasts is designed to share a more personal and honest perspective on all things watches. And Justin and Stephen are able to do that because The Enthusiasts is subscriber supported. That means they're accountable only to you, the audience. And we should say, of course, this isn't any kind of advertisement or promotion. We're simply recommending The Enthusiast because we enjoy the content and we want to support two friends who have long done the same for us. In fact, both Asher and I are paid subscribers, and you can become one too at theenthusiasts.net.
Well, today we're going to talk about the rise of independent watchmaking. These days, it seems like indie watchmakers and brands are everywhere, celebrated in watch media, on display at major retailers worldwide, hotly discussed in collector circles, and of course, gaining share in an otherwise entrenched industry. But it's an overnight success decades in the making, and today we have the perfect guest to guide us through the rise of these independents, Tim Jackson. Tim is a passionate advocate for independent watchmaking, with a deep-rooted appreciation for mechanical timepieces that dates back to his childhood living outside of Liverpool, England. His journey began with a Timex at age 10 and evolved into a lifelong fascination with horology that has spanned a career in the United Kingdom and now here in California. With over 30 years in the watch world, Tim has developed a particular admiration for independent artisans who push the boundaries of traditional watchmaking, and today he continues to champion these masters of micromechanical art, helping enthusiasts discover and acquire truly exceptional timepieces through his business, Independent in Time. And I am proud to say I have purchased several watches from Tim in the past as a client, and that had helped set me on my journey to become a retailer of independent watches today. So, Tim, welcome to Open Work. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Likewise. And we want to dive right in here. Many of us look back and trace the rise of independent watches to the late 1990s, when watchmakers and brands like Daniel Roth, F.B. Journe, and Urwerk really started their journey and landed on the scene. But I'm curious, when you think about it, which time period and watchmakers do you see as the true heralds of the modern independent watch age? Where did it begin for you?
So looking back, I was thinking about this the other day, probably the time period for me that was most significant, at least laid the groundwork, if you will, was sort of the early 2000s. I was based in the San Francisco Bay Area, working there, and I was on a watch website, probably the Purists or something, way back then. And somebody written something about an English watchmaker making watches with an enamel dial. And I had a certain appreciation for enamel dials, having worked with Ulysse Nardin as an authorized dealer. And so I was curious. So I looked up this fellow, Peter Speak Marin. Speak Marin was the name of the company, the fledgling company. And he had a little website. And there was a picture of this watch, the original Piccadilly. Beautiful, simple case in terms of sort of round, but it had this beautiful enamel dial with Roman numerals, white, very classic, lovely blued steel hands. I thought, wow, that's a great looking watch. So I did a little bit of reading, and that was it. And, I reached out to him that night, and in terms of an email, and thought, how do I get these watches? Because I was selling, or as part of a business that was selling IWC, Ulysse Nardin, Blancpain, and it goes on and on and on. Nothing to do with independence, but this watch was interesting to me because he used an enamel dial in basically this entry-level watch in a stainless steel case. And I thought, well, normally the brands of sort of Vacheron or Patek or anybody else, maybe other than Ulysse Nardin, used an enamel dial. An enamel dial, for those who don't know, is fired in a kiln, difficult to do. There aren't many people on the planet that actually can make these and make them well. And they're expensive compared to the regular stamped or a lacquered dial. So I thought, well, he's committed to using an enamel dial. That's pretty impressive. So I was interested. So I reached out to him, and a couple of months later, I got a call from his then wife, and we set up a meeting the next year in Baselworld. And when I met Peter in Baselworld, he was in this little tiny area in the AHCI where they had their own little stand way back off the sort of beaten path, and you had to sort of get back there. It was kind of dark. Lighting was atrocious. And we hit it off, and I ordered a few watches. Again, it was a very different way of doing business, if you will. You had to pay for them up front. And that was a quote unquote risk, if you will, because this was a no-name guy. Nobody had ever heard of him. So anyway, I committed to buying them under the agreement with him that should we not be able to sell any of these watches, he would take, there were 5 watches. He would take whichever watch I couldn't sell and swap it out for another watch. And when those watches arrived 4 or 5 months later, I knew because FedEx told me when they were going to show up. And I had a group of collectors sitting in my shop waiting for the box. And it came in. I walked in the back, opened it up, saw the 5 watches, and walked out. And we ended up selling 3 of them that afternoon.
And these were being sold to people who you were previously selling IWC and Blancpain and the rest to, I assume, yeah?
Yeah, these was very sophisticated, what I would think of as very sophisticated watch collectors in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, who had been exposed to across the board the big brands. These weren't just new watch collectors. They've gone through the gamut of probably starting with Rolex, let's say, or Omega, and then got into other brands, storied Swiss brands and German brands, Lange and Zerner owners and so forth. And they looked at these watches, and this was the original 38 millimeter Piccadilly. And they saw something that, obviously I saw as well intuitively, but I didn't know what was really going on. And I remember packing up the shop that afternoon and thinking, wow, the conversation 6 months before in Basel was, what happens if we can't sell the watches? And now it's like, well, how do I get more watches? Because if these 3 guys bought these watches right here and now, I need to be able to get some more watches from this fellow. So that's sort of how it started. And that was 2003 for me. And it was a shift for me because, up until that point, it was big marketed brands of the Swiss watch industry.
So you referenced a specific moment in time at Basel, and we've heard over the course of doing this pod from a number of different people who were either there at that time or either as watchmakers or attending the show. And it really, everyone always thinks about it and talks about it as this really sort of scrappy and just energetic era. We've heard from our friends at Zeitwinkel, for example, who, were on the later end of this, more like 2006, 2007, talking about what it was like to exhibit in that space. We've talked to our friends at Urwerk about it, who talk about displaying their watches on literal hot plates, and that it really felt like the kind of gonzo side of a very formal show at that era. So I'm curious, as somebody who is at that point in time focused so heavily on what were, relatively speaking, mainstream watches, had you gone into this part of the show prior to hearing about Peter? And what was it like walking into that space that first time? I mean, because the Speak Marine wasn't the only brand on exhibit in there, I suspect. Some other folks that we know of today, and some that probably are sadly no longer around, were in there. So what was the energy of that space? And who were the other dealers that were in there? Or was it, or no one?
Fascinating question, because that year that I met Peter in the AHCI area, which is if I set the scene, as you say, the main show in Baselworld was these, for those that never got there, which is kind of a shame because it doesn't exist anymore. But you had these essentially buildings within the exhibition space that were all the main brands, Rolex and Patek and so forth. you had to walk back to this little darkened area at the back to get to the AHCI. Now, I had walked by there almost accidentally 2 years before, the first year I was there, which was 2000, between meetings. And out of the corner of my eye, I remember it vividly, I saw this crazy looking watch in a little window, a vitrine that was probably 3 feet by 2 feet. And there was a gentleman standing outside. And what it was the Vianney Halter Antica Perpetual.
Cool.
And out of the corner of my eye, I saw this thing, and I'd seen it in a magazine, probably in Watch Time or something. And I was like, I stopped the group, my colleagues I was with, and said, hold on a minute, just got to go and see that watch. So I walked up, and there was Vianney. Back then, he didn't speak much English. And I was pointing at that watch. I said, excuse me, do you mind if I take a look at that watch? He goes, yeah, but of course. And he pulls out the watch, and I'm holding an Antica Perpetual. Couldn't believe my eyes. I'm like, oh my God, this thing's unbelievable. Again, as we all know, watches in person are very different from magazine pictures. And that was that. Again, I looked at it. I mean, I had a camera, didn't even have a phone camera back then. So I sort of took a pretty awful picture of it, I think, and it's somewhere on some hard drive. Handed it back to him. I said, thanks very much. And dashed off to the next meeting. And I sort of forget about it, but that was the first time. And he was in the AHCI area. And back then they had probably, I think maybe 7 or 8 of the members. And I don't know how they picked who got the exhibit, but Vianney was at the front of the AHCI stand that year. So that was the first time. So when I went 2 years later to meet with Peter, had an appointment, walked in, walked around, and there I noticed were colleagues of his. Marco Lang was there from Lang & Heine, as it was back then. Sven Andersen he was always in one of the exhibits or the vitrines as they were. Again, lighting was appalling.
In fairness, even in 2025 or 2024 at the AHCI, the lighting is still appalling. And I say that with love.
No, but I understand, and I know what you're saying. It's better, if you could imagine.
Okay, fair enough.
Because what happened was the hall had a sort of darkened area, and maybe it was somebody thought that these lighted windows, would sort of showcase the 2 or 3 watches, or one watch in some people's cases, that were there, and so that would sort of draw your eye. But as soon as you took the watch out of the window, out of the vitrine, and held it in your hand, you're standing there trying to see, how on earth can I actually look at the watch? It was ridiculous in a way. But anyway, as I look around, the other people that I would see there would be, they weren't dealers. There were no watch dealers that even paid attention, quite frankly, back then. It was crazy watch geeks who, I would bump into some people I now know quite well, but who, I didn't know back then, who were part of that sort of early sort of edgy watch collectors who actually did sort of go off the reservation from the big brands and thought, well, maybe there's something here, nutcases, as I call them, who were on the Purist Pro, who were looking at individual watchmakers as opposed to brands.
We've talked to a number of independent watchmakers and brands now about how difficult it is to finance their business, how difficult the economics of independent watchmaking can be. Everything from how do you raise capital to how do you source parts. Like, it's really challenging when you're a small operator in the Swiss industry to get suppliers, not even to answer the phone, but to actually deliver things when they say they will. I can only imagine how much more difficult and higher the stakes were back then. I mean, you mentioned there weren't even really any dealers walking
Right.
the halls. Like, the economics seem like they were quite different. I mean, as hard as they are today, I can't even begin to imagine what it was like. When did things start to change? Because I do think we're in a very different time now, like Asher mentioned at the top of the pod, where, yes, although overall in the big picture, independent watches still represent a very small segment of the entire watch industry, but it is a rapidly growing segment. and it has a disproportionate amount of mind share today relative to the size of the business. When did you see things start to change, starting to move from independent watchmakers being this sort of backwater of the industry, crazy guys and women who were willing to take risks, to starting to become a little bit more top of mind, a little bit more mainstream? How did that all take shape?
Well, I think there's maybe one main factor, and that is the technology that we have, that we all sort of use today. There's two parts of it. One is the internet and the growth of not only places like the Purists and what time zone, all that sort of stuff, where these were sort of chat rooms, but you had the access of social media starting, and you had and cell phones. What do those things do? Well, number one, cell phones or smartphones started to have cameras on them, so people were able to share information and pictures speak 1,000 words. That's sort of trying to think what time period. Prior to COVID, some of these watchmakers I've mentioned started to have a little bit more traction with watch collectors. Why? Because people were able to share pictures around the world sort of instantaneously. I don't know my timeline on terms of social media when that sort of started kicking off, but I'm going to say for late 2017, 2018 maybe. And so collectors were able to sort of connect over the internet, social media, share information about sort of cool stuff they're seeing or getting to handle. You also had these collector groups starting. You had the attention, and it got sort of turbocharged certainly during COVID for me, because there you had typically guys, but not always, who were not laid off, but were let's say sitting at home, and they had time. They had time to research stuff. Maybe they had a few more bucks in their pocket, and at the same time, I'm not an economist, but there was a huge amount of money pumped into the system, and guys started buying cool things because they couldn't go on their family vacation. Let's say they had a few extra bucks, but all the Rolex steel sport watches all became unattainable because people wanted to buy them, and then because of that, all the money chased it. Blah blah blah. Same thing with the Patek Nautilus. So at that time, collectors started getting a little bit pissed off, I think, some of them, and started looking, the attention shifted outside of the mainstream brands to, fortunately for me, because I always found these watchmakers compelling, to some of the independent watchmakers, some of the independent brands, some of the micro brands. And that was a shift. I'd never seen that, where people were comfortable spending, relatively speaking, a lot of money online. I didn't see a lot of people buying watches at $10,000 to $15,000, $20,000 online. That shift happened with COVID, and it sort of didn't have a choice. Couldn't go to a shop. You couldn't meet up. So if you still wanted to buy a cool watch, you had to kind of trust that I'm going to send my money to somebody. Okay, you do your due diligence and figure out who it is. Okay, they're a legitimate business. Okay, now I'll send my money to somebody. And people, for me, I got emails. People were asking me about certain watches. Can I buy this? Yes, I got it sitting in a safe. I use FedEx. I can ship it. So that was a shift for me of the attention going from big brands more into the independent world. And it's a good thing. However, there were certain watchmakers whose, just by definition, they can't make many watches. It's an individual, or sometimes two people. So then, because the sheer number of people around the world that are now fascinated by mechanical watches, there was too much interest, if you will. And that produced some negative results in terms of long waiting lists and basically people not having access to watches that they perhaps might normally have or had and wanted. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
You're getting to a place that I think is fascinating to us. I mean, not only because obviously we are independent watch retailers as well, but there has been a transition, certainly coming out of COVID, around the industry's expectation and interest in independent watches, which also has a direct impact on consumer experience related to buying these kinds of watches and learning about them. So we have similar experience to you, of course, where if somebody's contemplating the purchase of an independent watch, many of which, frankly, most of which are quite significant investments, they reach out to us or our team and have a personal relationship as they discover, learn about, and ultimately decide whether they're going to move forward with one of these watches. And that requires not only, the passion of somebody that's interested in this kind of art, but also, frankly, a lot of knowledge. And I'm curious, as the landscape continues to evolve, we go back 25 years. You're the primary retailer, so to speak, walking around in this space. Now, 25 years later, we see independent watches over the course of the last 2 decades appearing in major retailers. Some earlier than others. So a lot of respect, to some larger retailers that took that plunge far earlier than the rest of the industry. But now we're seeing independence in the big chains, Bucherer, in Watches of Switzerland, et cetera, and so forth. And I'm curious to know, and I realize it's a loaded question for all of us, but what do you see as good about that? And what do you see as bad about that? Because I don't, like, on a personal level, I don't know that I see it as either or. And I'm curious for your point of view.
The good is that these watchmakers now they're more mainstream, if you will. And, retailers, and I can only speak for retailers in the US because that's where I'm based now. I think retailers, they're an interesting bunch. They don't typically like to take risks. And, when I did it 20 something years ago, and to be fair, I didn't jump in, just go, let's just do independent watchmakers that nobody's ever heard of. It was, I'll bring in Peter first year. Next year was Marco Lang. Next year was Vianney Holt. Actually, Vianney was in there for day one, and it was alongside, storied Swiss brands. And I actually remember having a conversation with Peter Marin a year or two after I started working with him. And I said, I think there could be a case for having a shop that just sells independent watchmakers like you and Vianney and doesn't have big brands. And he looked at me like I was mad. He said, well, how are you going to get people in to buy the watches? Because we don't advertise. We don't have any marketing spend. I said, well, I haven't figured that part out. But, I said, and here's the reason why, because these are actually different products. Yes, they're wristwatches. Yes, they tell the time. But it's a different product. It's made in a different way. It's made for a different reason. And I think for consumers, it's a little bit confusing to have a Speakmer Piccadilly in a case for, let's say, $10,000 in stainless steel with an enamel dial. And you made maybe 10, 12 of those per year next to a Ulysse Nardin or a Blancpain or a Vacheron. That for a consumer, I've got I as this, the retailer, if you will, have to do a lot of work to explain why this watch is different. So I thought, if you have a shop that's just independent watchmakers, then you don't have that confusion for consumers. Anyway, he thought I was mad.
In fairness, maybe he was right.
No, he was at the time. He was. It took me, another 10 years to figure out that I could actually do that. But the reason I could do that was because of the internet and social media starting up, where consumers were finding these guys separate from me going to Basel World, coming back, writing my blog, taking some awful pictures in horrible light, and trying to sort of put it in a newsletter, let's say. The momentum was picking up. So that's a good thing. And as I say, retailers started sniffing around, if you will. I mean, I was at the bleeding edge of it. And I mean, I remember a retailer from Colorado came by into my shop in Silicon Valley. I don't know what year it was, probably 2004, 2005. And he had traditional great Swiss brands, but he was like, wow, you did a good thing getting Speak Marin. That's smart. And I just was like, well, I just think it's cool. I didn't understand if it was smart or not. And, within a year or two, he started working with some various different independent watchmakers. And so that started happening. And then I think of New York and Leon at Cellini, way back when, before I started working with independents, we were a Roger Dubuis dealer on the West Coast, 1999, 2000. Leon was in New York. Leon had some fantastic big brands and, established one of the probably top retailers on the US. And then, come to find, although the market shifted, he realized that many of the big brands weren't really working for him. But now today, fast forward, he's working with a lot of independents because, collectors' attention is there. They're much more compelling for a variety of reasons than the big brands. And he can, take care of his clients without having, the issue of, well, you can't get this because you haven't bought X number of pieces, or we're selling our special watches at our own boutiques, which is another, big thing that's happening with a big brand.
As you've retailed in the various incarnations of your business, there are some watchmakers that are exceptional that have not gained as much notoriety, whether they deserved it or not. Someone like Thomas Prescher, for example. The Nemo, by the way, is still one of my favorite looking watches out there. Utterly incredible watch. And then you've also worked with some watchmakers that have arguably broken through. And I'm thinking of like Bart and Tim, for example. And I'm curious, and this is, I realize
Bart and Tim Gronefeld.
Bart and Tim Gronefeld, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you think is the reason one brand breaks through and another doesn't? Because and I'll preface by saying, when we go to Geneva and we sit down with watchmakers and we ask somebody, who is this watch for? We almost always get a very similar answer, which is, it is for the connoisseur. It's for somebody that truly understands and appreciates the art form. It's for somebody that gets finishing, etc. And the thing is, that's not wrong. I would just argue that that's sort of a basic table stake for any fine watch that's being retailed at the price points that these watches are being retailed at. But there's a difference between what someone like a McGonagall, for example, which I reference because that's the watches that he's made are masterpieces.
Yeah.
And but still sort of is bubbling a little bit beneath the proverbial surface. Yeah. And the Gronefelds, where the Principia became essentially a knockout, drag down success for them for many years into the present. So what is the difference? Where do you see someone crossing over, and why?
What actually resonates with collectors versus, from one watchmaker to another? Again, I think that, and I don't know that I can answer that, because for me, I look at some of these watchmakers' work and I love it. I think it's great. Does it commercially sell? No. Why? I haven't, there's a magic to that. I would say generally, as I think about this, the watches that tend to sell best, there's two camps. Either it's a relatively traditional, classic, what people might think of as classic looking watch. So that's probably going to be round. It's going to be a simple time only watch. And we can look at all the watchmakers that have been incredibly successful there. Philippe Dufour, Kari Voutilainen, even Peter in the early days. Those are the watches that sold. You even go back to sort of the godfather, if you will, of George Daniels. Yes, he did some incredible, complicated watches, but at the end, when he produced his first serially produced watch, was the Millennium Series with Roger Smith. That was a time-only watch with a little date. The classics, and I mean, you go back to a Patek Calatrava. The classics will sell because the majority of people buy that. And then you've got the opposite end of the spectrum, the avant-garde designs of the Works or Vianney Halter's crazy stuff Stepan Sarpaneva, that appeal to a pretty small, narrow bunch of folks. why does one person's watch sell over another? It's a difficult thing. The design has to resonate, because at the end of the day, you put a watch on your wrist, you look at it, and you're looking at the dial, you're looking at the hands and the case. You're not actually looking at the movement typically, although there are some people that put movements on the front. So that's got to work. And then second part of it, for me, at least with the independence, was the personality behind it. Does that personality, is it congruent with the design of the watch? Are they able to communicate that? What we're seeing today with a lot of the smaller independent brands and even micro brands is the founders, the watchmakers, or the guys that are designing it have got a really good grasp of how to connect with other human beings.
One of the big insights we've had into the commerciality of independent watches and quote unquote what sells is just sheer force of personality, right? All the things you talked about make sense, and we kind of had a feeling of too, like a good watch is going to speak for itself. A watch that's classical in its nature is easier for a collector or an enthusiast to understand and appreciate than something that's maybe more avant-garde. But I think the thing that really surprised us was just how important personality is to the success of independent watch brands. And I think it comes from a place of good intentions. It's easy to roll your eyes and say, oh, someone like Max Busser is just a good salesperson, which, by the way, Max is an incredible salesperson. And that is a large part of what makes MB&F successful, in addition to the watchmaking and the creativity. But this speaks to the intangibles of independent watch retail. Just like you said, it's sometimes hard to know whether something is going to be commercial or not. All you can do is trust your gut to some extent.
Yeah.
You've retailed independent watches. You've retailed more mainstream brands. I think for a lot of collectors and enthusiasts, when they walk into the door of a retailer, whether it's a Watches of Switzerland, a Collective, or anywhere else, they sort of treat all retailers the same and assume that the economics of watch retail are the same, whether you're selling Omega or Speak Marin. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So from the perspective of someone who's done both, what are the unique economics? What makes independent watch retail from a business standpoint fundamentally different? So I would imagine when you were selling more traditional brands, there were things that kept you up at night. And I would imagine when you moved exclusively to selling independent watches, there were probably more things keeping you up at night, but they were fundamentally different things that kept you up at night. What are the differences in running those two kinds of businesses that you think would be helpful for a collector or an enthusiast to understand?
How to explain that, or how to answer that somewhat diplomatically.
I can tell you all about our deepest, darkest fears here, but we've only ever retailed independent watches, so we don't have any other comparison.
I would say looking back at my history, some of the struggles with the big brands, because of the way they operated their business. Back then, the gray market was a sort of a dirty word that I would go to Basel World and talk to these brands and say, you're asking us to spend whatever, a couple $100,000 or ordering these watches throughout the year. But, there's this website over, I keep seeing some of your watches show up, and, they're selling at, pennies, not penny on the dollar. They're 50%, 60%, sometimes 70% less than the retail price. What's going on here? I can't compete with that. Oh, well, yes. Tim, we're looking into this. We monitor these things, blah, blah, blah. What I came to realize is that the industry was basically earmarking about 10% of their annual sales to the gray market. What that meant was dealers with lots of cash would go over to Switzerland, knock on doors and say, hey, do you have any watches you need to sell cheap? I've got a check right now. And they all pretty much, I wouldn't say Rolex or Patek, but most of the brands all said, well, step right this way, sir. And these are brands that were owned, by the the three main holding companies at the time. Some of them weren't yet, but they were heading that way: Richemont, Swatch Group, and LVMH. And these brands, storied Swiss brands for the most part, would let these guys come in and they buy these watches that they couldn't sell through their primary channel. And their primary channel back then was people like me, was retailers all around the world. Fundamentally, they made too many watches for the marketplace and they needed some extra cash right on the, cash on delivery. Whereas the retailers were being sold watches and given terms to pay for them. So you didn't have to pay up front. You had 30, 60, 90, and then people would extend that because the nature of the retail business was couldn't make enough money on your margin unless you're selling at full price. Well, you didn't sell at full price because these watches were sold through the gray market. And any savvy consumer doesn't like to overpay. I don't like to overpay. And what happened is that these brands had no control over the pricing of their watches at the retail end of things. And many people would argue that's the free market at work. Well, if you're making a product, if you're an individual artisanal watchmaker, your product, is not sold as a commoditized item. It's sold as a piece of art, I would argue. And you should sell it for whatever you think it should be worth. And everybody should pay the same price. And everybody, if you're interested in a Dufour or a Kari or whatever, you look at it, you understand why it's cool, why the watchmaker, sat at his bench through years and years of training to get to that level of skill. And if you think it's cool and you have the money, you should pay him his price. But the big brands weren't sold that way. And so it was almost impossible. And that's what pushed me into the independent world, because with Peter and Marco and Vianney, there weren't enough watches. They were very small production, and it was a watch that I could sell. I could make enough money from a margin standpoint to go back to them and say, "Hey, I'll buy another 2 or 3 watches from you," because I had to pay up front. I didn't have this time lag and wondering whether or not I could sell watches and pay the bills. And it's a different way of running a business. It's not a volume type business. And that's typically what the watch, quote unquote, watch business was and still is to many people. And for me, I actually like watches. I'm fascinated by them. I like the people going back. I like the people behind them. It's not just a business of selling widgets, which is what a lot of people, it's a sexy widget business, but that's what the retail jewelry and / watch business is for a lot of people. And if you come into it with a lot of capital, you're churning business, you make your percentage and off you go and you continue building it. And you probably will have a successful business, but it's very capital intensive. Typically, the artisanal independent watchmakers, it's a different world. It's more akin to being an art dealer, I suspect. I'm not an art dealer
completely,
and that's where it's different. That's what I see as it being different, and it's much more interesting for me is to deal with individuals. There are many watchmakers whose watchmaking I love, I appreciate, but I never worked with them because they didn't need me to, they could sell every watch they make. Somebody like Reshep, I remember seeing his watch in 2019, the first chronometer contemporaine, thinking, wow, this is a spectacular watch. I'd seen his other watches under Carivia brand. They didn't really do anything for me aesthetically, but that's a personal thing. But seeing that chronometer contemporaine first time was like, wow, holy shit, that's a spectacular watch. That's my type of watch. It's an enamel dial, finishing is exquisite, incredible. And of course, that he just took off because going back to the earlier conversation, that was a classic, elegant looking watch.
You have led us into, I think, where I'd love to bring the conversation to a close around a really key point.
Mm-hmm.
And Reshep is the perfect example of this. That watch has become the stuff of obsessive legends.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had new clients contact me, for example, who we were talking about one watch, And then they'd come back to me and say, oh, what you showed me was amazing. I mostly collect Patek. What I'm really interested in is a piece from Recep Redzepi. Can you get me one of those? And there's sort of like, there's a cynical way to look at that, right? Which is like, sure, man. Or there's the other way to look at it, which is, all right, that watch clearly broke through in a way that others haven't.
Yeah.
And created a place for a collector that has dwelled in a specific region of the industry to feel safe is the wrong word, but to feel maybe invited into the world of independence. But at the same time, those who inhabit the world of independence feel a lot of frustration there, because, and Burneron is a good example of this too, where, now there's just not nearly enough watches for the demand. So my question for you is, how do we, as an industry, manage hype and watchmaking in a way that it doesn't become as toxic as we have seen it, as toxic as it became, say, during the pandemic, where watches that were absolutely not worth it, so like the 5711, for example, were being traded for comical amounts of money, and even today are still being traded for comical amounts of money relative to the watchmaking that exists in that watch. Meanwhile, watches like everything that Recep is doing today are exceptional watches, but are impossible to acquire, and that creates a different kind of negativity. Yeah. So, what would you say to collectors today and just the industry at large about how to balance these two things? Because without some of that hype, there are we lose people coming into this sector of the industry, but that hype also alienates large sectors of it. So, what's the right way to think about that balance?
I don't actually know, because and I don't think many people who were in the independent world could have predicted the level to which it got crazy. Oh God, I can't get it. Well, now I want it. And that feeds on itself. And here we are where Recep is sold out for whatever, 8 years. And I remember talking to him a couple of years ago in Geneva. I think this was a Chronometer Contemporain 2. And he was trying to figure out who he could assign the 50 watches to. I think it's 50. He's got his existing clients who bought the first watch. He's got now, I think he said he had 10,000 applications from all around the world.
Wow.
Meaning guys are saying, I'll give you a deposit. I want one of your watches. And how does he figure out who to turn down? He's going to piss people off. He pissed people off. I guess you could argue it's a good problem to have, but it is a problem because there just aren't, and these guys can't make enough watches.
I think one of the things that surprised me the most in retailing independent watches, because of course, Asher and I came into this, we didn't work a day in the industry before we started Collective. So we came in purely as enthusiasts with a love of watches, both mainstream and independents. And, when we decided to focus our business on independent brands specifically, at least for retail, I think one of the assumptions I had, which was very wrong, was what will be so nice about selling independent watches is that, and this isn't I'm not saying this is entirely wrong. It's just not full. It's not completely right.
Yeah.
One of the great things about selling independent watches is we'll be selling to kindred spirits, like-minded people who are open-minded, who have a deep love and knowledge of, watchmaking and want to support creativity and independent makers. And by the way, that's generally true, but it's not completely true.
Right.
What surprised me was how big of a factor hype is in purchase decisions for independent watches. I don't think I was ready for that. And of course, this is something we've learned over time, where we've been fortunate, where some brands we started with early have achieved some level of notoriety or hype, or many of the brands we work with, like you're saying, require a lot of education and don't have hype. And that's okay. That's what we signed up for. And that's what gets us excited and gets us out of bed in the morning. But in the conversations we have with a lot of clients, a lot of times we'll hear, oh, that's a great watch, but for that kind of money, I could get this thing, whether it's a Patek Philippe or another independent watch that's quote unquote more safe.
Yeah.
Or a house or a car.
or a house or a car, which is valid.
Right.
But I guess I was just so shocked by the role hype and psychology plays.
I think two things. Fundamentally, Tim, you said something that really resonates with me, which is when I describe our business to people, I often describe us as an art gallery more than a watch store, because I think what you've described is right. And inherent in that is this belief that when you are considering a piece of art, it's an emotional thing. It's not a sum of its parts, right? We don't buy we don't buy art based on the price of the canvas and the paint. We buy it because of its intellectual and artistic value. And what you're willing to pay for that is a supremely subjective thing.
Absolutely.
But ultimately what you're paying for really is the creativity and the wherewithal and the time of the artist. And to me, that's why I think the reframing of buying independent watches, not as retail, but as patronage, is such an important thing. Because if you start comparing something to objects that have, I don't want to say intrinsic value, but let's say defined market value,
mm-hmm.
It all starts to fall apart because you're kind of evaluating these things the wrong way. And that does not mean that a collector who looks at something and says, I don't know that I can put $30,000 into this. Like, that's completely legitimate. There's precious few things in life I can put $30,000 into. So I respect that completely. I think when that comment moves away from practicality to derision, I think is where we start to see some things fall apart. Whereas when a client looks at something, and I remember this because I remember the most expensive independent watch, the first truly expensive independent watch I ever bought was a Principia. Mm-hmm. And I remember 7 years ago, making, whenever that was, maybe 8 years ago, making the intellectual decision that I was never going to see that money ever again. That turned out not to be true, mm-hmm. But I remember when I ordered it, that's what went through my head. And as soon as I did that, because as soon as I did that, like, I was just filled with joy about it, because I'm like, it doesn't matter.
Right.
This is mine now. And making that jump, that intellectual leap, is so critical, I think, to being able to enjoy art fundamentally, because you're paying for it because you think it's worth it, not because you think it will, there's any value in it, or financial value in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think, in life, so many products typically have been sort of, people have had to, how do they evaluate something? And it comes down to, can it be sold for something later on in life? Should you have to sell it, or should you want to sell it? And in a way, I can see why why that's happened, but doesn't help for the process of evaluating a piece of art, an object that nobody needs. I've always said, I had a shop full of wants, never had a shop full of needs. As a jeweler, as a gemologist, I guess you could maybe argue that some people do need diamonds to celebrate, blah, blah. But on the watch side of things, these are purely pieces that people want. And if you have the money and the ability to do it, you're not going to, not pay your mortgage, then spend it on something cool. People travel, people go, spend money on all sorts of things. They've worked hard, and they should spend it. It makes the world go round. But to try to evaluate an artisanal or independent watchmaker's work against, and a well-known, serially produced watch from a brand that is a marketing machine, that's the reality of the world, in the watch world, of the big brands. They claim to be luxury products. They're no more luxury than, selling a toaster because they don't care. The consumer who's spending their hard-earned money isn't getting the luxury experience they should at price points that we're talking about. A watchmaker an individual watchmaker you spend a lot of money on, if you're traveling to where they live, they're going to be happy to take you out to lunch or meet you for a beer or something, and you can have an experience that's luxury. To me, it's that time, these experiences that you have. And, you buying a Principia from Bart and Tim, these guys have spent their life building their business, creating beautiful products. Who's to say what it's worth? Well, the person, when you put that watch on your wrist and you look at it and you go, wow, this thing feels great. It makes me feel good. It's an emotional connection. Consumers have missed that. And when they get that, when they're able to connect with a product that gives them that good feeling, it's pretty powerful.
I think that's probably as perfect a place to end this as we possibly can. And Tim, I can't thank you enough for spending this time with us. We appreciate you.
Absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you for listening. Open Work is a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com. And you can find our guest, Tim Jackson, online at independentintime.com and on Instagram at independentintime. To get in touch with your suggestions, your feedback, or questions, just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.